Hello and welcome to the neighborhood. My name is Andrew, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about Cyberpunk 2077. The Witcher 3 is an amazing game. In fact, it's my favorite game of all time. I put over 100 hours in the recently released next-gen version alone this year. And I'm not the only one. It has sold over 50 million copies. CD Projekt Red, the studio behind the game, rocketed to mainstream fame with the success of this release. So of course, everyone was excited to see what they would do next. Cyberpunk 2077 was actually announced before the release of The Witcher 3. It was announced in 2012, with teasers that followed in 2013. The Witcher 3 was released in 2015. It didn't really pick up steam as far as hype until 2018 though, when it won over 100 awards at E3, rest in peace, including Best Game and Best RPG, among many others. There were some concerns about the game being wildly different from the studio's previous work. This game was first person, while the Witcher games were all third person. It was a shooter, whereas their previous work had all been action combat, etc. But the majority of people had faith in CD Projekt Red at this point, so what little concern there might have been was quickly and easily brushed aside. The media and press did not get to play Cyberpunk before it was released. Instead, CDPR released a few hands-off gameplay demos that showed how incredible the game was going to be. These demos promised branching narratives that we had never seen before and insane first-person shooting combat that only elevated the already rising hype for the game. It also seemed to be one of the best-looking games ever made, with unbelievable levels of immersion in the world. It was also announced that there was going to be some serious star power, with Keanu Reeves announced as a major character in the game. As the game's release drew nearer, delays began to happen. It was initially announced for April of 2020, but was delayed 3 times and was ultimately released in December of 2020. This isn't uncommon for video games these days, especially when you consider the state of the world at that time. And even though the delays weren't a good sign in retrospect, gamers' hype levels were at critical highs and everyone still expected the game to be incredible. This was not the case. Even with the delays, the launch of Cyberpunk 2077 was a disaster. The next-gen version did not release at this time, so PS5 and the Series X owners had to play the last-gen version with the promise of a next-gen patch coming soon. However, they were the lucky ones. Gamers on the PS4 and Xbox One generation of consoles were met with an unplayable mess of a game that frankly should not have been released. On PC, people with high-end machines had a pretty great game on their hands. People with lesser PCs were a mixed bag. Some people, like my brother, could barely play the game at all without it crashing. Others had minor bugs and glitches, but everyone who played the game had the same realization that this was not the game we were promised. It was an impressive RPG with an interesting world and fantastic characters and writing, but it was not the game that CDPR had been marketing for all these years. Some systems in the game just didn't work. The police system comes to mind since it was very recently overhauled and fixed with the 2.0 patch. The visuals were good, but not mind-blowing. The world was a great video game world, but didn't achieve the levels of immersion we were promised. One area where promises were kept was with Johnny Silverhand, Keanu Reeves' character. He was a huge part of the game and a central component of the story. A lot of the times when a video game promises a celebrity appearance in their game, the end result can be lacking, but CDPR killed it with this one. Even though people who could play it enjoyed the game, like I did, and even though it was a critical success, CD Projekt Red had lost a lot of goodwill and had severely botched the launch of their game. Over time, updates and fixes were released for Cyberpunk that slowly but surely fixed a lot of the problems it had at launch. Performance is no longer an issue, and the game looks fantastic today. Many of the bugs and glitches were patched out. Along with that, support for the PS4 and Xbox One was dropped, and full focus was given to the current consoles and PC. It wasn't all good news though. The multiplayer mode that was promised for the game was completely scrapped, never to be heard of again. Along with these smaller patches that fixed bugs and issues with the game, there were bigger updates that changed the way the game functioned and added content to the game. In February of 2022, the next-gen update finally released and began the redemption arc for Cyberpunk within the industry. Another key moment in the game's turnaround was the Edgerunners anime that was released on Netflix in late 2022. Similar to the way that The Witcher 3 saw a huge spike in its player base when the Netflix show debuted, before we all realized how terrible it was, Cyberpunk had a revival due to the success of Edgerunners. This continued the positive momentum for the game with players and critics. After Edgerunners, the most recent developments in the Cyberpunk story have been the 2.0 update and the Phantom Liberty expansion. At the time of writing this, the 2.1 update has also just been released and seems to be only increasing the positive narrative around the game. The 2.0 and 2.1 updates are massive overhauls to the game. While they don't change the core gameplay loop or the story in any real way, they do completely change the way gear and talents work. They also add gameplay changes to the police system and vehicles, along with a variety of other gameplay mechanics. Basically, this is a big deal for the game in that it delivers some of what was initially promised back in 2018. Along with these updates, an expansion was released that adds a new area to the map, new characters, new side quests, and other content, and a whole new ending to the main storyline as well. CDPR once again leans on massive star power with the expansion by including Idris Elba in the game as a key character, and it works perfectly. Along with him, Keanu is still there and contributes heavily to the new content as well. While none of this magically turns Cyberpunk 2077 completely into the game that we were promised back in 2018, it is as close as it has ever been, and it has been impressive to see the studio work so diligently to fix what was broken and make the game the best experience it can be for the players. And it did change the narrative around the game. Cyberpunk 2077 was nominated for awards at the 2023 Game Awards and is largely considered a redemption story throughout the games industry and gaming community. Now it's time for the part of the video where my personal opinion gets to make an appearance. I personally had a really good time with Cyberpunk 2077 when it was released in 2022. I was very excited for it to come out, mostly because of my love for The Witcher. I'm not the biggest fan of the cyberpunk genre, and I was really bummed out when I heard the game was first person instead of third person. However, I had faith in CDPR like so many other people did. And I will admit, I had fallen for a lot of the hype leading up to the game's launch. So I picked up the game at release and dove in head first. The things I really loved about the game were its characters and writing. Very few developers can make me struggle with choices like CD Projekt Red can, or fall in love with characters the way that they can. The gameplay was fine and the world and setting did what they needed to do, but some of the storylines and character moments will stick with me forever. This studio does such a great job of telling stories that exist in the gray. At the time though, I felt like I was one of only a few people who enjoyed the game and wanted to talk about it as a game, not a news story. It generated a lot more traffic to write or make videos about how bad the launch was or how the PS4 version of the game looks like it was made in stop motion. While these are all valid criticisms and definitely worth discussing, it was hard to find conversations about the game itself. After I finished the game, I uninstalled it and moved on. I kept up with the news stories about its improvements, and I watched the first episode of Edgerunners, but I felt like my time with it was probably done. I was fine just waiting for the next Witcher project to finally release. That changed when Phantom Liberty was announced. Beside the fact that there was going to be a massive 2.0 update that was free to all players, major new story content with new characters piqued my interest. After all, that was what I enjoyed so much about the base game, so I decided to download the game and dive back into Night City. Initially, I started a new character because I had ambitions of replaying the whole game. After about 5 hours or so, I decided I would hop into my endgame character and see the new content. This was mostly because 2023 was a huge year for games and I wanted to be able to finish the expansion before making my Game of the Year list. And man, I had a great time. Phantom Liberty is incredible. I loved the new crew we are introduced to, and the spy/thriller story that the DLC brings to the table was an absolute blast to play. The gunplay and movement are as tight as ever, and I liked all of the changes to the skill tree and clothing and other systems that made the game a more intuitive and enjoyable experience. On the story side, there were multiple times where I sat frozen staring at my screen trying to decide what decision I was going to make because I didn't want to make either one. The overall plot of the DLC had enough twists and interesting moments from a top level to keep me engaged, but it was the relationships the characters had with each other and the motivations they had for their actions that really propelled me forward. On top of that, Phantom Liberty unlocks a new ending to the base game, and when I learned about that, I had to check it out and see how it compared to the original endings of the game. I'm not going to spoil anything here, but I will say that I was not prepared for how impactful and heartbreaking this ending was going to be. In the world of Cyberpunk, there are very few happy endings, and this nailed that tone to a T. I left my playthrough on that melancholy note, but I haven't uninstalled the game yet. There's still side content I could explore if I choose to do so, but even without it, Phantom Liberty reminded me why I love Cyberpunk 2077 so much. This brings me to a question that I will try to answer for you. Should you play Cyberpunk 2077? If you played the game at release or any time before the massive updates and the Phantom Liberty expansion, this is a great reason to jump back into Night City. I guarantee if you had a decent time in the original game, you're going to enjoy this DLC. If you liked the game a lot at release like I did, this may push you into loving it. If you loved it at release, you probably have already played it and you're just watching this because it's more Cyberpunk content, and for that, I thank you. If you have never played Cyberpunk 2077, maybe it flew under your radar or maybe you were waiting for it to be fixed, now is the perfect time. The game is in a fantastic place in general, and the Phantom Liberty expansion only adds to that already great experience. Yes, the game is not the second coming of Christ that was promised to us all those years ago, but it's still an amazing RPG with an incredible story and characters and really fun gameplay. And CD Projekt Red has done a tremendous job of fixing their mistakes and creating a truly memorable experience. So, if you've been curious or on the fence about trying it out, I would highly recommend diving in now. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like or a comment. It really helps the channel grow. If you want to go above and beyond, consider subscribing to our channel. If you want to hear even more of my thoughts on video games, check out our podcast on all the various podcast services. Thank you so much for watching, and I will leave you with a reminder to stay friendly, gamers.